And we're going to make sure that we're leaders around the world when it comes to battery manufacturing, electric vehicles.
Premier Ford on hand as Norwegian manufacturer Vianode announced a $3.2 billion investment into its synthetic graphite plant at Yarmouth Yard. And coming on the heels of Volkswagen's groundbreaking of its $7 billion PowerCo gigafactory producing batteries for EVs.
Canada itself has a stable, predictable political system and situation, so that's very important for companies investing a lot of money.
The investment will create 300 jobs in its initial phase, with 1,000 jobs at full capacity.
Canada just secured a win that cuts straight into the global supply chain battle, while the United States under Donald Trump braces for another wave of tariff fights and corporate lawsuits. A major European company has quietly made its verdict: trust the stable country. Trust the predictable country. And in 2025, that country is Canada. Norway's Vianode has chosen Ontario for a $3.2 billion synthetic graphite plant, one of the most strategic clean tech investments in North America. And whether Washington likes it or not, this is what real global confidence looks like. Vianode, a leading Norwegian materials company, will build North America's largest synthetic graphite production facility in St. Thomas, Ontario. Synthetic graphite isn't just another factory input, it is the backbone of the lithium-ion battery. It is the heaviest component by weight, a NATO-listed critical mineral, and today almost entirely controlled by China. 95% of global synthetic graphite supply still flows from Chinese producers, a dependency Western governments are desperate to break. Vianode's CEO, Burkhard Strauss, made the decision sound simple. Canada, he said, offers a stable and predictable political environment, the kind of environment a company needs when investing billions. The project begins with 300 local jobs and will scale to roughly 1,000 when the plant reaches full capacity. Production is expected to hit 150,000 tons of synthetic graphite per year, enough material for roughly 2 million electric vehicles. Ontario is backing the project with a $670 million loan. Ottawa, through Export Development Canada, has signaled support worth up to $500 million. The Canada Infrastructure Bank is assessing further financing. In the middle of a global contest for clean tech investment, Canada is putting real money behind its industrial strategy, and it is paying off. What makes the moment even striking is the backdrop. While Ontario loses thousands of jobs as Stellantis shifts Jeep production to Illinois and GM pauses EV van output in Ingersoll, Vianode is doing the opposite. It is moving toward Canada, not away from it. The timing of Vianode's announcement could not be more symbolic. North America is living through two political realities. In the United States, Trump's second-term tariff machine is back in full force, from sweeping duties on autos and metals to threats of 100% tariffs on China. The Liberation Day tariffs have shaken markets, pushed retailers like Costco into court battles against the White House, and created deep uncertainty for automakers who depend on predictable cross-border supply chains. Even the future of the CUSMA trade pact is unclear as Trump threatens to let it expire in 2026. Canada, meanwhile, is projecting stability. Prime Minister Mark Carney is expanding partnerships across Asia, securing defense and minerals agreements with South Korea and the EU, and positioning Canada as a reliable hub for clean tech manufacturing. Where the U.S. landscape looks turbulent, Canada looks deliberate. Global investors see the difference, and they have begun to vote with their money. Vianode choosing Ontario is not just an industrial decision, it is a geopolitical statement. Producing synthetic graphite requires enormous amounts of electricity. Most countries cannot offer clean, cheap, steady power at industrial scale. Canada can. Its grid is dominated by hydroelectricity and nuclear power, and more than 80% of national electricity already comes from emissions-free sources. That gives Canada something few advanced economies can match: the ability to decarbonize heavy industry without driving up production costs. Vianode says its technology cuts emissions by more than 90% compared to traditional Chinese methods, but the achievement depends on Canadian energy. Without hydro and nuclear, without a grid that is both clean and affordable, the numbers wouldn't work. This is why so many EV-related investments, from Volkswagen's battery plant to Stellantis LG's earlier projects, have landed in Ontario and Quebec. Companies want green electrons, long-term certainty, and a government willing to accelerate the clean power build-out. Canada offers all three.
For years, the Western world talked about reducing dependence on China. Very few countries actually acted on it. Canada is now one of the exceptions. By hosting Vianode's plant, Canada helps create a non-Chinese supply of synthetic graphite, a domestic capacity to support EV manufacturers, battery plants, energy storage companies, and even defense sectors across the G7. This sends a message. Canada is no longer just exporting raw minerals. It is building advanced processing capacity. It is moving up the value chain, and it is becoming essential to countries that need secure, democratic, environmentally compliant supply lines far away from Beijing's control.
For decades, companies entering North America went straight to the United States. That assumption is breaking. Trump's tariff waves, his threats to tear up trade agreements, and the ongoing legal challenges from American corporations have reshaped how global investors perceive risk. The North American giant suddenly looks unpredictable. The consequences are already visible. Automakers have delayed U.S. battery projects. EV production targets have been scaled back. Supply chain plans have been rewritten to avoid tariff exposure, and the looming 2026 CUSMA review casts another layer of uncertainty over companies that depend on integrated continental trade. Canada, in contrast, offers clarity. Investors know the rules. They know the climate policy direction. They know the grid will stay clean. The government will support industrial transformation, and long-term trade relationships will be honored, not threatened on social media. Vianode's CEO phrased it diplomatically, but the implication was unmistakable. Canada is the safer, long-term investment. This investment gives Canada more than jobs. It gives the country leverage in negotiations, leverage in supply chain deals, and leverage in the emerging clean tech race. As global demand for batteries accelerates, countries with processing capacity, not just raw minerals, will shape the next chapter of industrial geography. Canada is now one of those countries. The United States wants secure, reliable supply chains. Yet it is Canada, not the U.S., that is attracting the cornerstone projects needed to build them. As the world shifts to clean technology, Canada is not merely keeping pace, it is setting the pace.
Vianode's $3.2 billion decision is more than a factory announcement. It is a declaration that Canada has become the stable anchor in an unstable North America. While the U.S. wrestles with tariff shocks and political volatility, Canada is building a future-proof economy grounded in clean energy, critical minerals, and trust. Investors are watching, governments are watching, and the question now is simple. If Vianode made this move, who's next?
CEO Andy England was hit with an existential crisis.
Well, it was not good, that's for sure.
He runs the Minnesota-based Phillips Distilling Company, the maker of sourpuss.
Vast majority, about 98%, is sold in Canada. And so, in many ways, we think of it as being a Canadian brand. And so all the more reason we should produce it in Canada. We've moved to Canada and are proud of it.
It's a small but symbolically important victory.
Canada just scored one of the most unexpected symbolic victories of the entire Canada-US trade war. And it came from a bright red bottle sitting in a nightclub bar. Sourpuss, the hard-to-forget sweet and sour drink that generations of Canadians have taken shots with, has officially abandoned the United States and moved its production across the border to Montreal. In a year dominated by Trump's tariffs, trade threats, and nationalist pressure campaigns, it turns out a simple party drink has delivered one of the clearest messages yet. When Washington pushes, Canada pushes back. And sometimes the U.S. even loses business to us.
The story starts with a brand that most Canadians know by taste alone. Sourpuss was everywhere in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the kind of drink that lived behind the bar of every student pub and dive lounge. But what many Canadians didn't realize is that almost all of it was made in Minnesota by Phillips Distilling Company, a quiet American manufacturer that had grown deeply dependent on its northern market.
CEO Andy England told CBC they sold around $23 million worth of sourpuss in Canada last year, and that an astonishing 98% of all sales worldwide come from Canadian customers. In the United States, the product barely exists. Then Trump's second-term trade war kicked into gear. As he slapped broad tariffs on Canadian goods, tariffs on steel, tariffs on aluminum, tariffs on autos, several Canadian provinces quietly retaliated. They didn't need to pass new laws or create big headlines. They simply stopped buying American-made liquor. Shelves that once stocked U.S. spirits went empty. Orders slowed to a crawl. Entire categories disappeared almost overnight. For Phillips Distilling, it was an existential threat. If Canada wasn't buying, the company wasn't selling. Their entire business model was about to collapse under the weight of a political fight they had nothing to do with. So after months of emergency planning, they made a decision that says more about the current North American trade climate than any speech or press release could. They shifted sourpuss production from Minnesota into a factory in Montreal under a new 5-year contract. England didn't sugarcoat the message. He admitted openly that provinces, quote, clearly want to buy liquor made in Canada, and that the company understood and accepted the reality. What started as a provincial protest suddenly became a cross-border production shift. A tiny victory on paper, but one that trade experts described as, quote, symbolically important for Quebec and for Canada as a whole.
The remarkable thing about this story is not the brand, the product, or even the size of the deal. It's the way everyday Canadian consumers, along with provincial liquor boards, managed to flip the logic of Trump's trade war upside down. This wasn't a fight launched by Ottawa. It wasn't a retaliatory tariff crafted by lawyers. It was simply a collective decision that if the United States was willing to weaponize trade, then Canadians could weaponize purchasing power. And it worked. The broader political backdrop makes this moment even more meaningful. Trump, now deep into his second term, has spent the year escalating tariffs across the world. China, Mexico, Canada, Europe, nobody has been spared. He has tried to force companies and countries to reorient supply chains toward American factories. But the unintended consequence has become increasingly visible. Many American producers are discovering that being made in the USA no longer guarantees access to the Canadian market. As the tariffs stack up, Canadian buyers, from the largest retailers to everyday shoppers, are choosing domestic alternatives. And when that happens at scale, companies like Phillips Distilling face a simple calculation. They can stay in the United States and lose the Canadian consumer entirely, or move part of their operations north and keep their survival intact. This is not an isolated case. Reuters, Bloomberg, and AP have all reported this year that Canadian cross-border shopping is dropping sharply. Flights, weekend trips, gas purchases, grocery runs, all have softened dramatically. Canadians are making a quiet but powerful statement. In an era where the U.S. president treats trade like a blunt weapon, Canadians are treating their dollar like a shield. It is economic self-respect, and it is starting to change corporate behavior. The timing adds another layer. Canada is entering a new phase of economic independence under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who has spent the year pushing for a more diversified trade portfolio. His government is investing heavily in clean energy, critical minerals, and coast-to-coast infrastructure. It is building new links with South Korea, ASEAN, and India. It is recalibrating ties with China after the surprising APEC turning point meeting between Xi Jinping and Carney. And it is preparing for a combative USMCA review in 2026, where Canada is expected to take a firmer stance than ever before. Against that backdrop, an American company moving production to Montreal, even a small one, sends a signal that echoes far beyond the beverage aisle. It suggests that Trump's tariffs, far from strengthening U.S. leverage, are accelerating a North American realignment that benefits Canada in subtle but real ways. If even an inexpensive, low-margin liquor brand can't afford to stay American-made, what happens when the same pressure hits sectors like auto parts, food processing, or household goods? The truth is that Canada's influence in the trade war has never been military, and it has never been about threats. It has been about market gravity. Canada is a massive, stable, high-income economy with an 85% clean power grid, critical mineral resources, and a consumer base that still has trust in domestic institutions. Companies need access to that market, and if earning that access means moving to Canada, many of them will. Sourpuss is simply the early signal.
For the United States, especially the Trump White House, the optics here are uncomfortable. A policy designed to force production into America has instead pushed production out. A tariff meant to defend American industry has ended up eroding part of it, and a trade war intended to discipline Canada has instead revealed just how much leverage Canada actually has, not because of Ottawa's politics, but because of the choices of Canadians themselves.
In the grand scheme of global trade, one liquor brand moving factories won't alter the entire power balance. But symbolically, this moment matters. It shows that Canada isn't the quiet neighbor anymore. It shows that when pushed, Canadians can reshape markets simply by changing what they buy and what they refuse to buy. And it shows that Trump's trade war, far from putting Canada on the defensive, is increasingly pushing companies and supply chains toward Canadian soil. The question now is what happens next. If Sourpuss is the first brand to flee the U.S. for Canada, who will be the second? And what does it say about Trump's trade war when even American companies decide the safer future is north of the border? That's a story we'll be watching closely.
This is Hanwha's KSS-3 submarine, launched into the sea just in time for the Prime Minister's visit. Mark Carney climbed down 7 meters to check out what the South Koreans want Canada to buy.
When you walk through the Hanwha Ocean Shipyard in South Korea, you can feel the weight of industry. Towering cranes, welding sparks, and steel hulls taking shape on the water. It is one of the largest shipyards in Asia, 5 square kilometers of pure precision and ambition. And in late October 2025, amid that metallic rhythm, one visitor stood out: Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Cameras followed him as he toured the submarine line that could soon redefine Canada's Navy. Hanwha Ocean is one of 2 finalists competing to replace Canada's aging Victoria-class submarines. The South Koreans promised 12 new KS-3 boats, 4 by 2035, if a deal is signed by 2026. That single image, Carney standing among South Korean engineers, carried more meaning than a press statement ever could. While Donald Trump was in another city warning allies to buy American and tightening tariff walls, Carney was moving in the opposite direction. He was in Asia, exploring technology and partnerships the United States could no longer offer. For Canada, this wasn't just a defense procurement trip. It was a declaration of independence, an unmistakable signal that Ottawa is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to modernize.
The story behind Carney's visit runs deeper than submarines. It reflects a global realignment, now visible from Ottawa to Seoul. In recent years, South Korea has earned a new nickname, the Arsenal of Democracy. Once a nation rebuilt from the ashes of war, it is now on course to become the world's 4th largest weapons exporter. Korean firms have delivered artillery to Poland, tanks to Australia, and air defense systems to NATO allies. Now, they are bidding to build Canada's next fleet of submarines, a contract worth between $20 and $24 billion US. What makes Seoul's offer so attractive is speed and partnership. The KS-3 submarines are already operational for the Korean Navy. They can be built within the next decade using advanced robotics and modular construction. The proposal even includes technology transfer, crew training, and the creation of maintenance facilities on Canadian soil. It's not a one-off transaction. Seoul's Deputy Defense Minister has called it a long-term partnership aimed at strengthening Canada's own defense industry. That approach stands in sharp contrast to traditional American deals, which often keep production and intellectual property inside the U.S. border. For Carney, the choice is symbolic. By engaging South Korea, Canada is signaling to the world and to Washington that it will not be confined to a single industrial orbit. It is building new supply chains and friendships in Asia, where technology and cooperation come without the constant shadow of tariffs and political strings. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look at what's happening on the other side of the Pacific.
Since returning to the White House, President Trump has rebuilt his economic playbook around protectionism. Under the America First agenda, his administration has imposed sweeping import taxes ranging from 10 to 100%. Canada has been hit particularly hard, facing a 25% tariff on most industrial goods and an additional 10% on energy. For Ottawa, those measures have disrupted trade worth over $120 billion annually. Instead of retaliating, Carney's government chose a more strategic path. It began shifting Canada's defense and technology partnerships towards Asia, where nations like South Korea and Japan were eager to cooperate without political tension. That shift is not just economic, it's geopolitical. Every submarine Canada builds with Seoul, every maintenance contract it signs outside the U.S. is a quiet rebalance of power. It chips away at Washington's decades-long dominance over North American industry. In short, Trump's tariffs have accelerated exactly what he hoped to prevent: the diversification of Western allies away from U.S. factories. By pushing partners to the edge, the White House has forced them to find new routes, and Canada is proving that independence can be a strategy, not a risk.
It's hard to miss the symbolism. At the end of October, both Donald Trump and Mark Carney were in South Korea, but for entirely different missions. Trump met President Lee Jae-myung to finalize a $350 billion U.S.-Korea trade framework focused on reshoring and tight supply chain control. Carney, meanwhile, visited GOJ, where Korean engineers built submarines for their own navy. Two Western leaders, one country, two opposite visions. Trump came to enforce American terms, Carney came to forge new ones. One relied on tariffs, the other on trust. This contrast captures the fracture in today's Western order. The old model, Washington dictates, allies follow, is breaking apart. Canada's outreach to South Korea represents a new approach, where middle powers collaborate directly and trade capability, not obedience. As Trump's motorcade departed Seoul, Carney's team entered Hanwha's shipyard. For historians, it might mark the week Canada stopped orbiting Washington and started steering its own course in Asia.
A year ago, Canada seemed like a casualty of Trump's trade war. Tariffs on steel, autos, and lumber cut exports and threatened jobs. Economists warned of long-term damage. But by late 2025, the narrative has flipped. Instead of pleading for tariff relief, Canada is rebuilding through new alliances. Deals with Japan, South Korea, and Australia now anchor its industrial strategy. Partnerships that share technology instead of imposing restrictions. The submarine talks are more than procurement. They represent who controls the engines of innovation. If the deal goes through, it will bring thousands of jobs, advanced robotics training, and new supply chain opportunities inside Canada. More importantly, it proves that Canada can prosper outside America's shadow. Trump's tariffs tried to isolate Ottawa, but instead propelled it toward a network of Asian democracies eager for cooperation. Government officials expect the first submarines by 2035, the same year the USMCA review is due. By then, Canada's defense network could stretch from Vancouver to Busan, not just from Ottawa to Washington. The message is clear. While the US builds walls, Canada builds bridges. Partnership has replaced dependency. Strategy has replaced fear. And as the clang of steel echoed through Hanwha's shipyard, it symbolized something larger than a contract. The moment a nation reclaimed control of its industrial future.
From afar, it might look like an ordinary diplomatic visit. But in the global story of 2025, Carney's stop in South Korea speaks volumes. It shows that alliances are shifting and that middle powers like Canada can redefine their destiny without waiting for Washington. In a world dominated by tariffs and trade wars, this submarine project isn't just about ships under the sea, it's about a country surfacing with a new sense of confidence. Because while others build barriers, Canada is quietly forging steel, and with it, a new path forward.
You never know what comes out of a meeting with President Trump. He'll say one thing one day and change his mind the next day.
Quebec and Ontario have been hit hard by tariffs, auto parts, steel, aluminum, and lumber.
This is another opportunity for Carney to kind of push Trump along the path, possibly get him to scale back some of those sectoral tariffs.
In Washington, anticipation is building for one of the most closely watched meetings of the year. On October 7, President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney will sit down face-to-face at the White House to confront the trade war that has shaken the foundation of North America's economy. It will be their second meeting since Carney took office, and the stakes could not be higher. Both leaders arrive under pressure. Trump is facing a partial government shutdown and rising criticism over his reciprocal tariffs, a policy that has taxed Canada's steel, aluminum, lumber, and auto parts since February. Carney, meanwhile, is under fire at home as layoffs mount and exports slow. The two men carry the weight of economies that depend on each other but are now drifting apart. Across the border, premiers, governors, and business leaders are watching anxiously. At the recent Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Conference in Quebec City, Ontario's Doug Ford warned that failure is not an option. The region's industries, he said, sustain 55 million jobs across both countries. Those jobs are now at risk because of tariffs that have turned partners into rivals. Behind the calm language of diplomacy lies a harsh reality. Trump's economic offensive, meant to restore American strength, is hurting U.S. workers as much as Canadian ones. As the meeting draws near, the question echoing from Windsor to Detroit is simple. Will this be the moment the spiral ends, or will Trump's strategy backfire even further?
The uncertainty out of Washington, D.C. is a problem.
I can tell you that we're very concerned about the policies of the Trump administration.
The numbers tell the story better than any slogan. Under Trump's trade policy, duties ranging from 10 to 50% now cover nearly every major category of imported goods. Canada, America's top trading partner, has been hit especially hard. 25% tariffs on most products and 10% on energy exports since February 2025. Ontario's auto industry, deeply intertwined with Detroit, is feeling the pressure. Auto parts crossing the Great Lakes are taxed multiple times before reaching a showroom. Manufacturers report delays, canceled contracts, and rising costs. In Michigan and Ohio, factory managers admit the tariffs designed to protect American jobs are making it harder to keep workers employed. Steel and aluminum producers in both countries have slowed production. The U.S. International Trade Commission reports that American aluminum imports from Canada dropped over 30% between April and August 2025, while domestic prices jumped 20%. Construction firms and automakers now pay more for materials, pushing inflation higher. Even lumber, a symbol of North American cooperation, has become a flashpoint. Trump's 10% tariff on softwood lumber and pending 25 to 50% duties on furniture have rippled through the U.S. housing market. Retailers are cutting orders, and home builders warn that prices for new houses could rise by $8,000 to $12,000, according to the National Association of Home Builders. Several U.S. governors now side with Canada, calling the tariffs self-inflicted wounds. Their states depend on the same integrated supply chains that Trump's policy is disrupting. The irony is that while Washington talks about bringing jobs home, much of the pain is already landing on American soil. While Trump doubles down, Canada is quietly recalibrating. Prime Minister Mark Carney, facing domestic pressure, has refused to be drawn into Trump's theatrics. Instead, he is building what he calls a more self-reliant economy, one that can endure U.S. unpredictability. Quebec's Premier François Legault has laid out a vision centered on Hydro-Quebec expansion, critical minerals exports, and federal defense contracts. These projects, expected to create high-tech jobs, aim to replace the losses caused by U.S. tariffs and tie Quebec's future to energy and defense markets rather than a single neighbor. Ontario's Doug Ford urges cooperation between provinces and private investors to safeguard manufacturing. Ontario hosts the headquarters of nearly every major U.S. corporation operating in Canada. When cross-border trade slows, the impact is immediate. Across Canada, public sentiment has hardened. Trump's remark that Canada could become the 51st state turned irritation into defiance. A recent Ipsos poll found 80% of Canadians would never support such an idea, and 70% said the comment made them prouder to be Canadian. What began as an insult has become a rallying point for national pride. Behind this renewed unity lies a larger truth. Canada is no longer waiting for Washington to stabilize. It is expanding trade with Europe, Asia, and mineral-rich partners like Indonesia. The tariffs that were meant to isolate Canada may have pushed it toward new global opportunities instead. On October 7, 2025, the stage shifts to Washington. Outside the White House, protesters gather under both American and Canadian flags, demanding relief from tariffs. Inside, the stakes could not be higher. The U.S. government remains partially shut down over a budget impasse. Inflation has climbed above 4%, and business groups warn that the tariff shock is spreading through retail and construction. Trump, eager for a political win, wants Canada to concede on immigration and defense in exchange for lower tariffs on metals and autos. Carney arrives with limited leverage, but a clear goal: protect Canadian industries without giving up sovereignty. His aides call the meeting an attempt to reset the tone, not rewrite the entire USMCA. Trump's advisors insist the tariffs are working, citing $170 billion in duty revenue since the policy began, according to the Treasury Department. Yet, manufacturing output fell 1.3% in the third quarter, and consumer confidence is at its lowest since early 2023, based on the University of Michigan's index. Carney faces critics at home who say he has no results to show. But for Trump, the risk is greater. If the tariffs continue to strain the economy, the political backlash could hit his base across the industrial Midwest. Whatever emerges from the Trump-Carney meeting, the message for North America is already clear. Tariffs may project strength, but they are a fragile foundation for prosperity. The United States and Canada are not just trading partners, they are two halves of a shared economic engine that runs on trust and open borders. Trump's America First doctrine promised to rebuild industry by isolating rivals. Instead, it has tangled supply chains, alienated allies, and raised costs for families. Even Republican governors now admit economic nationalism cannot thrive in a region built on integration. In Canada, the adversity has triggered adaptation. The focus on renewable energy, strategic minerals, and defense manufacturing could make the country a resilient northern hub in the global economy. The irony is unmistakable. By trying to weaken his neighbor, Trump may have accelerated its independence. As the two leaders leave the meeting room, one question remains. Will this confrontation lead to cooperation, or will the border harden further? Trade wars are never won. They only remind us how much nations depend on one another and how fragile that bond becomes when politics takes control.